Harold woke up before the sun that morning, just like he did every other day. He pulled on his boots, splashed cold water on his face, and stepped outside into the quiet dark. The air was cool and smelled of wet grass. His old farm sat at the edge of a small village, far from the big cities and far from the problems of the world. That was how Harold liked it. Simple. Quiet. Peaceful. He had no wife anymore. No children either. Just his animals, his land, and his work. That was enough for him. He did not know that somewhere far away, in the great royal city of Valethorn, something terrible had just happened. The royal nesting ground sat high on a stone cliff behind the Dragon Palace. It was the most protected place in the entire kingdom. Tall iron walls surrounded it. Guards stood watch every hour of the night. Powerful mages had placed protection spells over every corner of it. No one could get in. No one could get out. That was what everyone believed. But when the head guard, a tall man named Gordon, walked into the nesting grounds just before sunrise to check on the hatchlings, he stopped cold. The nests were empty. 3 small nests made of gold straw and warm stone sat in the center of the grounds. And they were all empty. Gordon stared at them for a long moment. He thought he was still dreaming. He rubbed his eyes and looked again. Still empty. He turned and ran. Within minutes the alarm bells were ringing across the entire palace. Soldiers poured out of every door. Mages ran through the halls with glowing hands. Servants pressed against the walls and whispered to each other in fear. And at the center of it all, in the great throne room, stood Queen Mother Sora. Sora was not like the dragon rulers of old stories. She did not breathe fire at her servants or crush things in anger. She stood very still, which was somehow worse. Her golden eyes moved slowly across the faces of every soldier and guard in the room. Nobody spoke. Nobody dared. Then she said, in a very quiet voice, "Find them." That was all she said. But every person in that room understood exactly what it meant. The Dragon Council met within the hour. They were a group of 12 elder dragons and 6 human advisors who helped run the kingdom. They argued about what could have happened. Some said it was an enemy nation. Some said it was thieves who wanted ransom. One advisor named Peter said quietly that perhaps the hatchlings had simply wandered out on their own, as young creatures sometimes do. Nobody listened to Peter. They never did. By the time the sun was fully up, hundreds of soldiers were already riding out of the city in every direction. Scouts flew on fast horses toward the forests, the mountains, the rivers, and the outer villages. Mages used their spells to search from the sky. Ships were checked at the ports. Every road out of Valethorn was blocked and watched. The search was the biggest the kingdom had ever seen. But the hatchlings were not in the forests. They were not in the mountains. They were not on any ship. They were not anywhere that soldiers or mages thought to look. Back in the city, the rumors started almost immediately. People spoke in low voices at the market. They gathered in small groups outside their homes. Some said they had heard that the hatchlings were stolen by a dark wizard from across the sea. Others said they had seen shadows in the sky the night before and believed the babies had been taken by something large and unknown. One old woman near the city gates told anyone who would listen that she had heard crying in the night, coming from the direction of the palace. Small, thin crying. Like babies. Most people did not believe her. The fear grew fast. The baby dragons were not just any creatures. They were the heirs to the dragon throne. The oldest one, though still very young, was already being prepared to one day rule beside its mother. If the hatchlings were gone, it meant the future of the entire kingdom was gone with them. People understood that. Even the farmers and fishermen in the outer villages understood that. By evening the news had spread to every corner of Valethorn. Riders carried the word to villages and towns in all directions. The message was always the same. 3 royal hatchlings. Missing. Report anything unusual immediately. In the small village near Harold's farm, the village leader, a round-faced man named Arthur, read the message aloud in the square. People stood in silence and listened. Some of the women covered their mouths. Some of the men looked at the ground. A few children asked questions that their parents did not know how to answer. Harold was not in the square that evening. He had already gone back inside by then. He had finished his work, eaten a quiet dinner, and gone to bed early as he always did. He had not heard any message. He had not spoken to anyone in the village that day. He did not know about the missing hatchlings. He did not know about the Dragon Council or the search parties or the fear spreading across the kingdom. He only knew that tomorrow morning he would have to wake up before the sun again, pull on his boots, splash water on his face, and go out to check on his animals. And that is exactly what he planned to do. He had no idea that when he opened his barn door in the morning, everything in his quiet and simple life was about to change. Harold woke up before the sun, just like always. He pulled on his boots, wrapped his old coat around his shoulders, and stepped outside into the cold morning air. The sky was still dark. A few stars were still visible above the trees. The village was completely quiet. He picked up his lantern from the hook by the door and walked slowly across the yard toward the barn. His boots crunched on the frost-covered ground. The chickens would need feeding. The old horse would need water. It was the same routine every single morning, and Harold found comfort in that. No surprises. No trouble. Just work. He reached the barn door and pulled it open. The horse was standing at the far end, calm as usual. The chickens were still sleeping. A few bags of grain sat stacked against the wall. Everything looked normal at first. Then Harold lifted his lantern a little higher. In the far corner of the barn, behind a stack of old hay, something moved. Harold went still. He thought it might be a fox that had gotten in during the night. He took one slow step forward and held the lantern out in front of him. He saw 3 small creatures huddled tightly together in the corner. They were pressed against the wall, shaking badly. They were not foxes. They were not anything Harold had ever seen before on his farm. They had small scaly bodies, short legs, and tiny wings folded against their backs. Their eyes were closed. Their breathing was fast and shallow. Harold stood there for a long moment and just looked at them. They were clearly very young. They were clearly very cold. And one of them, the smallest one in the middle, was shaking far worse than the other 2. The one on the left had a wing that was bent at a strange angle, tucked awkwardly against its side. The one on the right was awake and watching Harold with wide, tired eyes. It did not move. It just kept its body pressed firmly against the sick one in the middle, as if it was trying to share its warmth. Harold took a slow breath. He looked at the 3 creatures for another moment. Then he turned around, walked back to the house, and put a pot of broth on the fire. He did not run to the village. He did not send for anyone. He did not stand in the barn asking himself questions he could not answer. There would be time for questions later. Right now these creatures were cold and hurt and they needed help. That was the only thing Harold was thinking about. He came back to the barn with a bowl of warm broth, a clean cloth, and a thick wool blanket. He moved slowly and kept his lantern low so the light would not startle them. The one with the watching eyes tracked his every step but did not hiss or pull away. Harold crouched down a few feet away from them and set the bowl of broth on the ground. He waited. For a while nothing happened. Then the watching one stretched its neck forward and sniffed the air. It looked at the bowl. It looked at Harold. Then it lowered its head and drank. It drank slowly at first, then eagerly. Harold pushed the bowl a little closer and waited again. The sick one in the middle stirred. Its eyes opened halfway. They were a deep amber color, cloudy with fever. Harold reached out very slowly and placed the back of his hand against the side of its small head. It was burning hot. Far too hot. Harold clicked his tongue quietly, the same sound he made when one of his animals was unwell. He pulled the wool blanket gently around all three of them, tucking it close without touching the injured wing. The one with the watching eyes stiffened for a moment, then relaxed. Harold turned his attention to the injured wing. He could see it was not broken all the way through, but it was badly bent and swollen near the joint. He soaked the clean cloth in cool water and pressed it gently against the swollen area. The creature flinched and made a low sound, very quiet, almost like a whistle. Harold kept his hand steady and his voice low. "Easy now," he said softly. "I am not going to hurt you." He did not know if they could understand him. He talked to his horse the same way and the horse could not understand him either. But it always helped somehow. He wrapped the wing carefully with a strip of clean linen, not too tight, not too loose, just enough to hold it still and support it. The creature let him do it. By the time he was finished it had closed its eyes again and its breathing had slowed a little. Harold sat back on his heels and looked at all three of them. The watching one had finished the broth and was now pressed back against the sick one again. The injured one was asleep. The sick one was still breathing fast but looked a little more settled under the warm blanket. Harold hung his lantern on the hook above them so the light and warmth would reach them through the night. He fed the horse, scattered grain for the chickens, and then pulled an old wooden stool to the entrance of the corner and sat down. He was not going to leave them alone. Not yet. He sat quietly in the warm barn as the sky outside slowly began to lighten. He did not know what these creatures were. He did not know where they had come from or how they had ended up in his barn in the middle of the night. But they were alive. They were a little warmer now. And they were not alone anymore. For Harold, that was enough for the moment. 3 days passed quietly on Harold's farm. The hatchlings were getting better. The sick one in the middle was no longer shaking. Its fever had come down slowly over the first 2 days, helped by warm broth and the heat of the lantern. It was still weak, but its eyes were clearer now and it had started eating on its own. The one with the injured wing was moving around more, though Harold made sure it did not flap the wrapped wing too much. He changed the cloth bandage every morning with fresh clean linen and cool water. The watching one, the one that had been awake that first night, had become something like a guard. It followed Harold everywhere. When Harold fed the chickens, it followed. When Harold drew water from the well, it sat on the edge and watched. When Harold ate his breakfast at the small table by the window, it pressed its nose against the glass from outside until Harold opened the door and let it in. Harold did not encourage this. But he did not stop it either. By the third morning the hatchlings had moved out of the barn corner on their own and were exploring the yard. They were still small enough to move quickly through the long grass. They chased the chickens in a lazy sort of way, not to hurt them, just because the chickens made interesting sounds when startled. They found the old water trough and splashed in it until they were soaked. They climbed on top of the hay bales stacked near the barn wall and rolled off the other side. Harold watched all of this from the porch with his morning tea and said nothing. He still did not know what they were. He had a rough idea now. He was not a young man and he had heard old stories all his life, stories about the dragon throne and the royal hatchlings and the kingdom of Valethorn far to the east. He had never paid those stories much attention. They were the kind of stories that belonged to other people, to soldiers and nobles and important men. Not to farmers. But looking at the three creatures tumbling through his yard in the morning light, Harold had a quiet feeling growing in his chest that told him the stories were about to become very much his business. He pushed the feeling aside and went to fix the fence along the south field. That same morning, on the road that ran through the outer villages, a royal search party was moving fast. There were 12 soldiers on horseback, 2 mages in dark traveling cloaks, and a junior officer named Walter who had been riding for 4 days straight and was in a very poor mood about it. They had already searched 6 villages and found nothing. The locals in every place had been cooperative but unhelpful. Nobody had seen anything unusual. Nobody knew anything. Walter was beginning to think the hatchlings were simply gone. They rode into the small village near Harold's farm just before midday. The village leader Arthur met them in the square with a nervous expression and answered all their questions as best he could. No, he had not seen anything strange. No, none of the villagers had reported anything. He was very sorry he could not be more helpful. The soldiers began moving through the village, knocking on doors and asking the same questions over and over. One of them knocked on the door of a farmhouse just down the road from Harold's land. The woman who answered was Agnes. She was Harold's nearest neighbor, a sharp-eyed woman of about 60 who grew vegetables and kept bees and noticed everything that happened within half a mile of her home. The soldier asked his questions. Agnes started to say she had not seen anything unusual. Then she stopped. She thought about what she had seen that morning from her upstairs window. 3 small creatures running through Harold's field in the early light. She had thought they were large lizards at first. But lizards did not have wings. And lizards did not climb hay bales and roll off the other side for what appeared to be pure enjoyment. She had told herself it was none of her business. Harold was a quiet man who kept to himself and she respected that. But these were royal soldiers standing at her door asking directly. And Agnes was not a woman who lied to soldiers. She told them what she had seen. Walter had the horses moving within 2 minutes. Harold was at the south fence when he heard them coming. He looked up and saw the dust rising on the road before he saw the soldiers themselves. He straightened up slowly and watched them approach. 12 horses. Soldiers in royal colors. 2 men in dark cloaks who did not look like soldiers. Harold set down his fence post and walked to his gate. He did not feel panic. He did not feel the urge to run inside or hide the hatchlings or pretend he did not know what was happening. He had done nothing wrong. He had helped 3 small creatures that were cold and hurt. That was all. He reached the gate just as Walter pulled his horse to a stop on the other side. Walter looked down at the old farmer in muddy boots and a worn coat. He looked at the quiet farm behind him. He opened his mouth to begin his official questions. Harold spoke first. He looked up at Walter with calm, steady eyes and said simply, "They are safe. Come and see." Walter stared at him. Harold unlatched the gate and pushed it open and turned and walked back toward the yard without waiting for a response. After a moment Walter dismounted and followed. The other soldiers came through the gate behind him one by one. And there in the yard, rolling in the grass in the warm midday sun, were 3 small dragons. Alive. Healthy. Completely unbothered. The soldiers stood in a long silent line and stared. Harold picked up his tea from the porch step, took a sip, and waited for someone to say something. Walter sent a rider back to the capital before the sun moved another hour across the sky. He did not write a long message. There was no time for long messages. He wrote 4 words on a small piece of paper, folded it, pressed his seal into the wax, and handed it to his fastest rider. The 4 words were, "They are alive. Found." The rider rode through the night without stopping. By the time the message reached the palace it was early the next morning. A palace servant carried it through 3 hallways and 2 guarded doors before placing it into the hands of the Dragon Council's head advisor, an older man named George. George read it again, and then walked very quickly to the throne room. Sora was already awake. She had not slept properly in 4 days. She was standing at the great window that looked out over the city, still and quiet, the way she always was when she was holding something very heavy inside herself. George crossed the room and held out the paper without a word. Sora took it. She read it. She was still for a long moment. Then she turned from the window and walked toward the great doors at the far end of the room. George called after her. Your Majesty, should I prepare an escort? A proper party? It will take time to arrange. No, Sora said, without turning around. The great doors opened. She was gone. She was in the sky within minutes. No escort. No guards. No royal banners or formal procession. Just Sora, flying fast and low over the land, her golden wings cutting through the morning clouds like blades. Back at Harold's farm, the soldiers had made a kind of quiet camp near the gate. Walter had told them to stay calm and stay back and not touch anything. Harold had brought out a pot of tea and set it on the porch without being asked, which none of the soldiers had expected. 2 of them had accepted a cup. The rest stood near their horses and tried to look official. The hatchlings had ignored all of them completely. They had eaten their morning meal, splashed in the water trough, and then gone into the barn and fallen asleep in the hay, exactly as they had been doing for the past 3 days. The sick one was curled in the middle. The other 2 were pressed on either side of it. The bandaged wing rose and fell slowly with each breath. Harold had checked on them twice already that morning. Both times they were fine. Both times he had pulled the barn door mostly closed behind him to keep the morning chill out. He was at the fence again, working quietly, when one of the soldiers called out from near the gate. Harold looked up. The sky to the east was changing. It was not clouds. The color was wrong for clouds. It was a deep warm gold, moving fast and getting bigger. Harold straightened up slowly and watched it come. The soldiers were already moving. Some stepped back. Some grabbed their horses by the reins to stop them from bolting. The 2 mages in dark cloaks raised their hands and then seemed to think better of it and lowered them again. Walter stood completely still with his mouth open. Sora came down out of the sky like a falling star. She was enormous. Harold had known in the back of his mind that she would be large. The old stories had always said so. But knowing a thing and seeing it are 2 very different experiences. Her wings spread wide over the entire south field as she descended, blocking the sun for a moment and casting a great moving shadow over everything below. The ground shook when she landed. A wave of warm air rolled across the yard, bending the long grass flat and sending the chickens into a screaming panic in every direction. Harold grabbed the fence post to steady himself. Sora folded her wings and stood in the field with her golden eyes fixed on the farmhouse. She was blazing, not with fire exactly, but with a deep inner light that made the air around her shimmer and shift like heat rising off summer stone. She looked at the soldiers. She looked at the yard. She looked at the barn. Then she looked at Harold. Harold looked back at her. He was not going to pretend he was not afraid. He was. His heart was going very fast and his hands were not entirely steady on the fence post. But he did not run. He did not drop to his knees the way 2 of the soldiers behind him had already done. He just stood at his fence and looked at her. Sora moved toward the barn. Her steps were careful, deliberate, much quieter than Harold expected from something so large. She stopped at the barn door and lowered her great head toward the gap. Inside, the 3 hatchlings were asleep in the hay. Sora was completely still for a long time. Harold watched her from across the yard and said nothing. He could see her eyes moving over each of the 3 small shapes in the hay. He could see her taking in the clean bandage on the injured wing. He could see something shifting in her expression, though he could not have said exactly what it was. Then she turned and looked at Harold again. She crossed the yard toward him slowly. When she stopped she was close enough that Harold could feel the warmth coming off her like a low fire. She looked down at him from a great height. Her golden eyes were very clear and very direct. She said quietly, "You are human. You owe us nothing. Why did you care for them?" Harold looked up at her. He thought about it for just a moment, not because the answer was difficult, but because he wanted to say it right. Then he said plainly, "They were cold and hurt." What else was I supposed to do? Sora looked at him for a long time without speaking. Behind Harold, nobody made a sound. Sora was quiet for a long time after Harold spoke. The yard was completely still. The soldiers near the gate had not moved. The two mages stood with their hands at their sides and their eyes on the ground. Walter had still not closed his mouth. Even the chickens had stopped making noise, as if the whole farm understood that something important was happening and had decided to be respectful about it. Harold waited. He was good at waiting. Farmers usually are. Finally Sora spoke. Her voice was low and measured, the kind of voice that did not need to be loud to fill a space completely. "You fed them," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," Harold said. "You wrapped the wing yourself." "Yes." "You stayed with them through the night." Harold nodded once. "The first night, yes. After that they seemed settled enough." Sora looked at him for another long moment. Then she turned her head toward the barn where her children were still sleeping in the hay. She was quiet again for a while. When she turned back to Harold her expression had changed. It was still serious. But something in it had softened, just slightly, in the way that very strong things sometimes soften when they finally feel safe enough to do so. "You will be rewarded," she said. "Whatever you ask for. Gold. Land. A title in the royal court. A house in the capital city. Name it and it is yours." Harold listened to all of this politely. He looked at the ground for a moment, then back up at her. "I do not need gold," he said. "I have enough land. And I would not know what to do with a title." He paused. "But there is one thing." Sora waited. "The small one," Harold said. "The sick one in the middle. I brought its fever down as best I could with what I had here. Warm broth and rest and keeping it out of the cold. But I am a farmer, not a healer. I do not know if I did everything right. I do not know if there is something still wrong inside that I could not see or fix." He looked at her steadily. "I would like a proper healer to look at it. Someone who knows what they are doing. Just to make sure it is truly well." The yard was very quiet. Sora looked at Harold for a long moment. Something moved behind her golden eyes. It was not surprise exactly. It was something closer to the feeling a person gets when the world does something unexpected and good and they are not quite sure how to hold it. "That is all you ask," she said. "That is all," Harold said. Sora was quiet for just a moment more. Then she turned her head and spoke to the mages in a low voice. One of them nodded quickly and moved away toward the road, already reaching into his cloak for something. Harold did not ask what was happening. He trusted it would be handled. Sora looked back at him. "A healer will be here before sunset," she said. "The best one in the kingdom." Harold nodded. "Thank you." They stood together in the quiet yard for a little while. Sora looked around at the small farm. The patched fence. The old barn with its slightly crooked door. The vegetable patch along the south wall. The rope on the well that had been replaced so many times it was made of 3 different kinds of cord tied together. "You live here alone," she said. "I do," Harold said. She did not say anything else about that. Harold was grateful. After a while Sora moved back toward the barn and pushed the door open gently with her nose. She made a very low sound, barely audible, deep and soft like a note played on a very large instrument. Inside the barn there was a rustling in the hay. Then the hatchlings came out. The 2 stronger ones moved toward their mother quickly, pressing against her legs and making small sounds. Sora lowered her head and touched each of them gently. The sick one came out last, blinking in the daylight, still a little slow on its feet but moving on its own. It looked at its mother. It made a soft sound. Sora touched it very carefully with the tip of her nose and held it there for a moment. Then the sick one turned around. It looked across the yard at Harold. It walked toward him. Slowly, a little unsteadily, but on its own. It crossed the yard and reached Harold and pressed itself against his legs. Harold looked down at it. He reached down and placed his hand very gently on top of its small head, just for a moment. "You are going home now," he said quietly. "That is a good thing." The hatchling made a sound that Harold could not describe. Then it turned and walked back to its mother. Sora watched all of this without moving. When the hatchling had settled back against her, she looked at Harold one last time. Her golden eyes were very clear in the morning light. "They will remember you," she said softly. "Dragons do not forget kindness." Harold looked up at her. He nodded once. Sora spread her great wings slowly. The warm air rolled across the yard again. The grass bent flat. Harold stood still and watched as she lifted from the ground, the three hatchlings held safely close, rising higher and higher until they were above the trees, above the hills, growing smaller against the wide blue sky. He watched until he could not see them anymore. Then Harold turned around, walked back to the porch, picked up his cold cup of tea, and went inside to put the kettle on. He had a fence to finish.